And for more insights on the impact and repercussions of Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminium, let's speak with Frank Lavin. He's visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Mr. Lavin's also the former Undersecretary for International Trade at the U.S. Commerce Department. Frank, good to have you on the show. We like the new look, by the way. Let me start by drawing on your experience at the Commerce Department. Now, is there a right and wrong way to respond to tariffs? We know what the EU and Canada have done. They've retaliated, but we also know that the UK and Australia have not. Albanese saying Australians are ultimately the ones who will suffer. What do you think?
Well, I think the response is somewhat predictable. I think when domestic politics are front and center, Canada's looking at an election, they've got to respond robustly. Europe has had to deal with a series of strains in the relationship with the U.S., and so they have an incentive domestically to respond effectively. Australia enjoys generally positive relationships and doesn't have that domestic need. I'd say whatever countries can do to not escalate is going to lead to better outcomes, but there's always a domestic political incentive to do something.
Frank, the UK response is also interesting. Keir Starmer basically only saying that he's disappointed so far. And it appears that this could be a bit of a risk, right? I mean, he gained a lot of goodwill by taking the lead with Ukraine, but now he's not going along with the EU.
Right. On the other hand, he had a personal meeting with Trump in the Oval Office, so there's probably a bit of personal chemistry there. He extended an invitation from the King for a state visit to London, which Trump accepted. So there's a political agenda there that's at work that might be promising. So I think he's got more to put at risk, where Europe, continental Europe, Trump, for whatever set of reasons, just seems to have a lower opinion of them. And there's not really any kind of personal chemistry or political agenda at foot. So I'm not surprised UK is differentiating itself a bit from the EU in this.
I see. And Frank, what's different this time around from the first Trump administration is that countries friendly to the U.S. are not exempt from tariffs. Canada, Australia, for example. What do you think are Mr. Trump's goals right now? And do you expect kind of a regrouping of trade alliances?
Yeah, it's a rather audacious opening act by President Trump, I have to say. And I think what it tells me is just as a management style or as a philosophy, he likes to use friction. And that he likes to be audacious and have a very theatrical display early on, and then see how that unsettles the markets and how people respond to it. By the way, that it does bring shock value. It does speed things up, but boy, it can backfire as well. So I think he got somewhat of the result he wanted from Mexico, but he's not getting the result he wants from Canada or China or Europe. So it seems to me he's created more problems than he's solving.
Okay, so Frank, I mean, these tariffs could give America's steel and aluminium industries that boost he's talking about, but they're also likely to increase costs for consumer goods from cans and cars, et cetera. How do you think the Trump administration will measure the success or failure of these tariffs? Now, concessions from trade partners, would that?
Well, look,
yeah.
In general, tariffs just impose a burden on the economy. So in general, it's bad news for businesses, for consumers, for inflation. It's a cost. The only way I think Trump can declare victory or sort of pull the rabbit out of the hat, if these tariffs and this trade war is a very short duration and it doesn't have open-ended ongoing escalation, in which case he could say after a few weeks, look, I had to do this. I had to be the bad cop to shock our trading partners, but I did get some kind of response from them. If this goes on more than a few weeks, I think the cost vastly overshadow whatever benefits he might achieve.
Yeah, given the potential economic pain from tariffs you're just talking about, just how far can American consumers and industry then absorb these additional costs before political or social pressure could potentially force a change in strategy?
By the way, I think it's already sort of there, meaning the stock market response and polling data tell us that there is discomfort or unease with what Trump is doing. So any president brings some goodwill with him, especially early in the administration. So there's some tolerance or patience, but there's also an undercurrent of unhappiness with what he's doing. And my guess is he does only have that window of a few weeks in order to wrap this thing up in an orderly fashion.
Frank, I want to get further insight into your thinking about tariffs. I mean, I'm not sure you have a clear stance on it. I can see how they might be useful when there's dumping taking place or when, heavy subsidies are being given. I mean, are there instances beyond those where they might be warranted and they might be useful?
Well, I'd say in general, tariff is more useful as a threat or as a symbolic device than actually a policy implement that is put into place. So the threat of tariffs, it can spur negotiations and can move things the right way, but implementing them is usually just a step backwards. The one approach, to my mind, that makes sense is if you have a revenue neutral series of offsetting tariffs, meaning tariff hikes are paired with tariff reductions. So if you're unhappy with China, for example, rather than just impose a tariff on China, which also brings costs for the U.S., you could reduce tariffs with other trading partners. You could reduce tariffs with Vietnam, for example, or Indonesia, and that would at least offset whatever problems you might be creating in China. So that would be, I think, a more sophisticated and a more beneficial approach for the U.S. economy. But that is not part of Trump's package.
Yeah, and I want to take your point on how these tariffs could potentially backfire the U.S. Because if we look at the first Trump administration, really the Biden administration did not take back some of those tariffs, and also the U.S. did not get the what they wanted from China when it comes to trade. So in this time around, how do you think this could backfire?
Well, I think a large part of his complaints just don't have a lot of validity to it. I think in general, Canada and Mexico and Europe and Australia and the UK were very good trading partners, rules-based, compliant trading partners. You might have a complaint or two here or there, but in general, the system sort of worked. China is in a separate category where I think they did have predatory pricing and activity that violated trade norms in many respects. But Trump's sort of scattershot approach, where he's penalizing every trading partner for every issue there is a bit baffling, because if everybody's guilty, nobody's guilty, and you can't really focus your resources on that. So he's really, I think, reflecting just a general unhappiness with the international trade architecture than a complaint over any specific country and any malfeasance.
I see. And in some ways, really, Asia benefited from the tariffs from the first Trump administration. Companies rerouted trade to avoid levies. This time around, what options do companies have? And are there still kind of a silver lining here for Asia?
Well, I think after we work through all this, we'll have some stability return. So that, in a sense, is silver lining. I mean, I don't see 4 years of a fist fight, 4 years of friction and turmoil and recriminations, that there's a limited appetite for this. And I think Trump, after he sort of made his statements and gotten some kind of resolution out of them, I think he's more or less settled down. And don't forget, in his first term, he did institute a digital free trade agreement with Japan. So one of the hopes for this term is that we take that digital free trade agreement instituted for ASEAN and start those discussions as well. Now, that would be a nice step ahead for the ASEAN nations as well as the U.S. I think the way Trump operates, you've got to get this bad news out of the way first, and then we'll see if he's got scope for some good news.
Yeah, and on a whole, Frank, do you expect more or less globalization up ahead after the series, this trade war?
Well, I think the logic of international trade unfolds regardless of what policy is undertaken. And as I was suggesting a minute ago, the digital activity doesn't require logistics, and so it can be, in some sense, almost cost-free in terms of movement. So the more that our economy relies on apps and digital communication and services that are done online, the more likely we're just going to see increased international trade, increased globalization of these services. Online education, online health, and so forth, I think will continue apace.
Okay, Frank, we'll have to leave it there. But thank you very much for your insight this morning. Frank Lavin, visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and former Undersecretary for International Trade at U.S. Department of Commerce. Thank you.